Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler. I'm sure those names sound more than familiar to you. They were the leading forces of the Nazi regime, World War II, and the Holocaust. But have you ever heard of Sophie and Hans Scholl, Alexander Schmorell, or Christoph Probst? Well, it's about time. Hello, servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio, on and off since 2016. When people talk about Nazi Germany and the Third Reich, it often has this notion of the evil Nazis versus the people, implying that all Germans were suppressed and forced to go along with this tyrannical regime. And yes, many were, but what's often forgotten in this context is that Hitler and his party, the NSDAP, had a lot of support among the German population. Over the course of 5 years, they went from a small splinter party to the strongest one in the entire country, with almost 44% of the votes in the parliament election of 1933, which is the same year that Hitler became Chancellor. So the party was elected into power democratically, even though at the beginning they had to form a coalition with 2 other national conservative parties, but they quickly got rid of them. They also gained an exponential amount of party members. By the end, in 1945, they had about 8.5 million members, which was about 10% of the German population at the time. Now, 10% might not sound like a lot, but when you compare it to the membership numbers of the biggest German parties today, it's more than 20 times higher. And being a party member meant applying to join the party, being accepted, paying a membership fee, attending the meetings, possibly even taking over administrative positions within the party, and many other responsibilities. So there was certainly a threshold to become a party member. There was even a 4-year period where they had stopped accepting new members altogether. Yet, over 8 million Germans ended up joining. With that in mind, imagine living in Nazi Germany as a college student in your early 20s, surrounded by so many people who admire Hitler, voted for the NSDAP, and share their racial ideologies. But you decide to speak up, criticize the regime, along with your closest friends, and end up paying with your life. That's the story of the Weiße Rose, the White Rose, a non-violent resistance group in Munich that was led by 5 students and 1 professor at the Munich University LMU, the same university I went to. Their names were Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl, Alexander Schmorell, Christoph Probst, Willi Graf, and Kurt Huber. Since you clicked on this video, I'm sure a lot of you enjoyed German history in general and like to watch documentaries and historical dramas. And if you want to be able to finally understand the original dialogues in those, I can only recommend today's sponsor, LingoPie. Because with LingoPie, you can learn a language while watching TV. They have thousands of hours of amazing TV shows, movies, documentaries, and other content in 10 different languages, including German, of course. The best part is the interactive subtitles that allow you to click on words for an instant translation. You can hear the correct pronunciation,
Herrscher,
and add words to your personal vocabulary list that you can then go over afterwards with the customized flashcards and game quizzes for better retention. Depending on your language level and preferences, you can turn on the subtitles in the target language, in your native language, or see them both at the same time, and you can slow things down if it's a little too fast for you. You can also open up the script on the sidebar to get a better overview of what's been said, and even jump back and forth. This way, you'll never go to the next scene without having understood what's going on. You can even practice your pronunciation and get immediate feedback. And with the Netflix extension, you can use LingoPie with some of the most viral Netflix shows, movies, or comedy specials. For the history people among you, I'm sure you've seen All Quiet on the Western Front, but believe me, it'll add a whole nother layer watching it in the original German version. All of these shows were huge hits on Netflix. I've seen almost all of these, so definitely worth checking out. Or if you've always wanted to know what German comedy is like, you can now watch this special by Felix Lobrecht, who's one of the biggest comedians and podcasters in Germany. You can try LingoPie completely for free for 7 days. Just click on the link in the description below, and after those 7 days, my link will get you an exclusive discount. I put all the details down below, so don't miss out on it, and enjoy binge watching your way to fluency. It's It's 1933, and Hitler has just become Reichschancellor of the Weimar Republic, Germany's first democratic state, which he and his party are quickly turning into a totalitarian police state, a dictatorship. In Ulm, a picturesque city in Baden-Württemberg, the 14-year-old Hans Scholl decides to join the Hitlerjugend organization, the Hitler Youth, even though his parents are strictly against it. But they've always encouraged Hans and their other 4 children to go out and form their own opinions. Hans's father, Robert Scholl, is an accountant and former politician, a pacifist, and a strong opponent of Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP. A few years later, he'll even go on to be imprisoned twice for calling Hitler a Gottesgeisel, so scourge of God, for doubting Germany's chances of winning the war, and for listening to enemy radio broadcasts. Sophie, Hans's little sister, also believes in the ideals of camaraderie propagated by the Nazis, and at the age of 12 joins the female branch of the Hitler Youth, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls. Most of her classmates are members as well, and so are her older sisters, Inge and Elisabeth. Sophie particularly enjoys the outdoor activities they get to do in the organization: hiking, camping, singing around a bonfire, but she doesn't really fit in with the National Socialist image of an ideal German woman. As a teenager, she wears her hair in a short boy's haircut, likes to dress in her brother's shirts, and she starts smoking at an early age, which the Nazis don't encourage, especially for women. At the age of 16, she starts dating Fritz Hartnagel, a career soldier, but unlike many other girls of her time, she has ambitions beyond being a mother and a housewife. She's a free spirit at heart, who, just like the rest of the family, enjoys art, music, and literature, especially philosophy and theology books. Some of her favorite authors include Rainer Maria Rilke, Georg Trakl, and the ancient bishop St. Augustine, but she also reads authors who've been banned by the Nazis, such as Thomas Mann or Heinrich Heine, as well as foreign authors from France or Russia. She also enjoys a lot of the art that's been labeled as degenerate by the Nazis. What many people don't know is that Sophie isn't just interested in art, she's also very talented at drawing and painting herself, and even gets to illustrate a German-speaking book of Peter Pan and Wendy in 1939. But we're jumping ahead. Sophie is a very enthusiastic and involved member of the League of German Girls. Just like her brother Hans, she even takes on leadership positions in the organization. But as they grow older, both of the siblings start doubting the Nazi regime and the Hitler Youth more and more. Particularly when Hans gets in trouble due to his affiliation with another youth organization that engages in singing Russian folk songs, among other things, and tends to have members who consider themselves communist. Hans and a few of his comrades have incorporated some of these customs into their Hitler Youth group as well, which is why in December of 1937, he's arrested by the Gestapo, so the secret state police, and so are his siblings Sophie, Inge, and their youngest brother, Werner. Sophie, who's 16 at the time, is released after just a few hours, but Inge and Werner are brought to Stuttgart, where they're being questioned for about a week. Hans, on the other hand, is detained for several weeks, during which time they also charge him for homosexual behavior. He ends up admitting that he had 2 homosexual relationships as a teenager, but fortunately, the allegations against him are eventually dropped, and he's able to leave the trial with a clean slate in both cases. From there, he returns to the barracks in Bad Cannstatt, where he completes his 2 years of conscription, before, in the spring of 1939, he moves to Munich to study medicine. But only half a year into his studies, in September of 1939, Hitler invades Poland and thereby kicks off World War II. For Hans and the other medical students, this means that they have to join student companies, and during their semester breaks, they have to serve at military hospitals at or near the front. In the summer of 1940, Hans participates in the Battle of France and is assigned to what's called the 2nd Student Company in Munich, where he meets fellow medical student Alexander Schmorell in April of 1941. Alexander was born into a well-off family in Russia, but after his mother died from typhus, his German father moved to Munich with him at the age of 4, where he grew up bilingually. after he volunteered to join the Wehrmacht and took part in the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia, he enrolled to study medicine at the University of Hamburg, but later transferred to the University of Munich. Hans and Alex not only share the same love for literature and art, but also their complicated past with the Nazi regime. While Alex didn't get arrested, he did get in trouble with his higher-ups while completing the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, and he even refused to say the Hitler Oath when joining the Wehrmacht. But they took him anyway. At university, the two now come in contact with even more people who are critical of the Nazis and get to engage in intellectual discussions. Their experiences working in a war zone and treating wounded soldiers in Munich further reinforce their aversion to what they consider a senseless war that causes unnecessary pain and suffering. Meanwhile, in Ulm, Sophie is finishing up secondary school, but she finds it increasingly difficult to come to class every day. Jewish classmates have started to disappear. Her progressive teachers are getting replaced by loyal Nazi supporters, and the school even asks students what their families talk about at home and encourages them to tell on their parents if they speak badly of Hitler. Sophie would never do that. Instead, she starts to question the Nazi-trained teachers and slowly realizes that critical thinking is not encouraged under the Nazis. Conformity seems to go over individualism and freedom in this dictatorship. Her boyfriend Fritz, on the other hand, who's fighting on the Eastern Front at this time, is still a loyal supporter of Adolf Hitler and believes in the cause of the war. Sophie and him don't get to see each other in person a lot, but they do write each other. This is a snippet from a letter that Sophie sends him shortly after the beginning of the war.
Ich kann es nicht begreifen, dass nun dauernd Menschen in Lebensgefahr gebracht werden von anderen Menschen. Ich kann es nie begreifen und finde es entsetzlich. Sag nicht, es ist fürs Vaterland.
Nevertheless, the two respect each other and even get engaged later on. After she graduates with her Abitur degree in the spring of 1940, Sophie starts an apprenticeship to become a kindergarten teacher and even completes additional training at the Fröbel Institute, hoping that the training would be recognized as a replacement for the Reich Labor Service, which is now also mandatory for women and a prerequisite for attending university. Unfortunately, they don't let it count, which is why in 1941, Sophie is forced to spend 6 months working at a farm, followed by another 6 months completing the newly required Kriegshilfsdienst, war relief service, at a daycare. After that's completed, she's finally able to pursue her passion and decides to follow her big brother Hans and study at the University of Munich, where she enrolls for biology and philosophy in May of 1942. Just a quick reminder, at this time, Germany is deep into World War II and suffering significant losses on the Eastern Front, even though the Nazi propaganda is successfully distracting people from that fact. Everything from food to fuel is being rationed, public buildings are covered in swastika banners, the Hitler salute is mandatory in numerous public settings, and even in private encounters, it's highly expected, and Jewish people are forced to wear yellow stars in public, have heavily restricted rights, and millions are being deported to ghettos and concentration camps, where many of them are brutally murdered. And of course, speaking up against the regime can get you fired, imprisoned, or even sentenced to death. Now, when Sophie arrives in Munich, she barely knows anyone in the city, so she's very excited to be introduced to Hans's friend group, which, in addition to Alexander Schmorell, soon also includes Willi Graf and Christoph Probst. Christoph is an old childhood friend of Alex's, who grew up with a very liberal mindset, a Jewish stepmother, and an educated father who studies Indian philosophy, among other things, and is friends with several degenerate artists. At only 22 years old, Christoph is already married and has 2 small children. Willi Graf is the newest member of the group. He just moved to Munich a few weeks before Sophie to continue his medical studies and was assigned to the same student company as Hans and Alex. He's Catholic, which is why growing up, he actually refused to join the Hitler Youth despite threats that he wouldn't be allowed to complete his Abitur degree otherwise. Instead, he was a member of a Catholic anti-Nazi youth organization called Grauer Orden, Grey Order, which years later got him arrested for a few weeks. He too has worked as a medic at the front lines in Belgium, France, and Yugoslavia. The misery he encountered there is a major factor in why he's come to the conclusion that he needs to take action. And then there's Traute Lafrenz, who also studies medicine and has recently transferred from Hamburg to Munich. Alex already knew her from his time in Hamburg and introduced her into the friend group. For a few months, she has a romantic relationship with Hans, but even after they break up, they stay close friends. Together, the friends enjoy going to concerts in Munich and talking about philosophy and literature, often with befriended professors, authors, and other intellectuals. They also discuss their political views and regularly listen to the speeches by Thomas Mann on BBC Radio. Mann is a German writer who won the Nobel Prize in 1929, but since he strongly opposes the politics of the Nazis, he first left Germany for Switzerland and then moved to the United States. From there, he now records monthly radio broadcasts called Deutsche Hörer, so German listeners, in German that are flown out to London and then broadcast by the BBC in Germany. In these 8-minute-long addresses, he regularly condemns Hitler and the war and calls for passive resistance. For a few months now, the group has been organizing nightly reading sessions for a small circle of students where people give speeches and engage in often controversial discussions. In June, one of these events is attended by Kurt Huber, a popular professor who teaches philosophy and musicology at the university. Hans and Alex have visited his lectures in the past and have come across him at private gatherings of Nazi opponents around Munich. Huber is Catholic, and due to his political views, which he only subtly reveals in his lectures, the university is keeping an eye on him. Though it's not at a point where they're trying to fire him, they have been denying him his own academic chair for years now. So in order to get a better standing, he's actually joined the NSDAP. Regardless, his beliefs have stayed the same, which is why at the reading session, when the group discusses how to deal with the inner conflict of your conscience versus the Nazi regime, he shouts,
Man muss etwas tun, und zwar heute noch.
In that same month, June of 1942, Hans and Alex sit down and write a leaflet, kind of like a manifesto that's densely filled on both the front and the back page. The headline says, Flugblätter der Weißen Rose, which translates to Leaflets of the White Rose, and the number 1. The name is most likely a reference to the book Die Weiße Rose by German author Beth Raven, but it's also possible that the name is inspired by exiled nobles during the French Revolution who had a white rose as a symbol on their flags. Hans, however, later claims during an interrogation that the name was picked randomly, but that's not really a statement we can take at face value, since naturally it would make sense for him to lie and hide a lot of things during these interrogations. In general, there aren't a whole lot of documents on the founding and the work of the resistance group, because having any official records of these illegal activities would have been extremely risky and could have been used against them at any given time. With the money that Alex regularly gets from his father, they're able to buy a typewriter and a small hand-operated duplicating machine. Unfortunately, modern-day printers haven't been invented yet, so every single copy takes a lot of time. In the house of Alex's parents, they make about 100 copies of the leaflets, pack them in envelopes, and mail them anonymously to a list of intellectuals who they assume their words will resonate with, but also to a few restaurant owners in hopes that they'll spread the word to their guests. They simply copy the mailing addresses from the telephone book. At the bottom of the leaflet, it says, "We're asking you to copy this leaflet with as many carbon copies as possible and further distribute it." Here's the full text with an English translation for you. Feel free to pause the video if you want to read it. Among other things, it talks about the destruction of German cities by the Allied powers and how it's important to start passive resistance before all German cities are nothing but rubble, just like Cologne, which recently was heavily bombed, and before the remaining youth of the country has bled out for the Nazis' racial ideology. The leaflet starts with the sentence,
"Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct."
And it demands,
"Wherever you may be, forestall the spread of this atheistic war machine before it's too late."
We don't know for sure whether or not there is a final push that gets Hans and Alex started on their leaflets, but one of their inspirations is most likely the leaflets that the Scholl family had found in their mailbox mailbox in Ulm a few months earlier, with sermons by the Catholic Count of Gallen, who had publicly criticized the arrest of Jews, the arbitrary acts of the Gestapo, the Nazi attacks on the church, and the involuntary euthanasia program, aka mass murder, of people with disabilities. Someone must have put the sermons in print and distributed them. Another factor could be that just a couple months before, the Nazis executed a group of communists in the Scholl's home state of Baden-Württemberg. And Sophies boyfriend Fritz has been writing to her about how horrified he is by these mass shootings of Jews that he's been witnessing. But regardless of what the catalyst might have been, within just a few weeks, Hans and Alex write another 3 pamphlets, quoting extensively from the Bible, Aristotle, and Novalis, as well as the German writers Goethe and Schiller. Not only do they criticize the actions of the Nazi regime and talk about the inevitable loss of the war, they also emphasize that it's every German's political responsibility to follow their moral duty for resistance. The second leaflet specifically calls out the mass murder of Jewish people in Poland and calls it das fürchterlichste Verbrechen an der Würde des Menschen, so the most frightful crime against human dignity. The leaflet also states that the German population carries partial guilt for this because they contributed to creating this government.
Why tell you these things since you are fully aware of them? Or, if not of these, then of other equally grave crimes committed by this frightful subhumanity. Because here we touch on a problem which involves us deeply and forces us all to take thought. Why do German people behave so apathetically in the face of all these abominable crimes, crimes so unworthy of the human race?
The third leaflet calls for sabotage in order to initiate a political revolution. It gives people a list of things they can do in their everyday lives to help overthrow the government, like not giving any of the donations that the Nazi regime is asking for, sabotaging your work in the armament industry, during events, celebrations, or in organizations of the Nazi party, as well as sabotaging your work in the media or any other profession that directly or indirectly helps the government. And the fourth leaflet particularly calls out Hitler's lies and propaganda. One part goes like this.
Every word that comes from Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war. And when he blasphemously uses the name of the Almighty, he means the power of evil, the fallen angel, Satan.
In this leaflet, they also remind people that despite a few recent victories on the battlefields, Germany is still losing thousands of men every day. So the leaflet warns against premature optimism. It ends with,
Wir schweigen nicht, wir sind euer böses Gewissen. Die Weiße Rose lässt euch keine Ruhe. We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace.
Of course, criticizing Hitler and the government is illegal in Nazi Germany. It's usually considered treason or sedition. And even just being in possession of a document like this is highly dangerous, which is why over 100 people end up reporting the leaflets to the Gestapo. So they start investigating. Now, whether or not Sophie and the rest of the group are actively participating at this point isn't 100% clear. For a while, it was generally believed that Sophie first came across the leaflets out in public, like everyone else, which then led her to believe that her brother could be behind this. Her sister Elisabeth, however, later stated that when Fritz was on leave and visited Sophie in Munich in May of 1942, she asked him for 1,000 Reichsmark and if he could get her a duplicating machine through the military, which implies that she may have been involved in the resistance group from the beginning. She wouldn't tell him what she needed it for, but he had a hunch and made sure that she knew what consequences any type of resistance could have.
Bist du dir darüber im Klaren, dass es dir den Kopf kosten kann? Ja, ich bin mir darüber im Klaren.
Her brother Hans says something similar during an interrogation later on.
Was ich damit auf mich nahm, wusste ich. Ich habe auch damit gerechnet, dadurch mein Leben zu verlieren.
What's certain is that once Sophie is a member of the resistance group, she helps with printing, but also functions as the bookkeeper and acquires materials like paper, envelopes, and stamps. Since all of those things are heavily rationed in Nazi Germany, she often buys several small quantities at different post offices, which also helps avoid any suspicion. As a woman, she's also helpful to the group because she's less likely to be randomly stopped by the SS. Right after the first 4 leaflets are published, the group finds out that Hans and Alex, as well as Willi Graf, are being sent to Stalingrad for 3 months to serve as medics. This famous photo was actually taken outside the East train station in Munich right before the guys have to leave for Russia. This one looks a little happier. From the end of July to early November 1942, they once again experienced the atrocities of the war firsthand. This is also the time when Hans and Alex truly start to bond with Willi. All 3 of them refuse to view the Russians as enemies, and thanks to Alex being fluent in Russian, they instead approach them openly and forge personal ties, thereby breaching military rules. Willi later writes to his sister,
"The war here in the East leads to things so terrible I would never have thought them possible. Some things have occurred that have disturbed me deeply. I wish I hadn't had to see what I have seen. I could tell you much more, but do not want to trust it to a letter."
The only positive aspect of this time is that Hans is stationed in close proximity to his little brother Werner, who was drafted to fight for the Wehrmacht right out of high school. The 2 actually get to see each other in person several times. In the meantime, Sophie has to work in an armament factory in Ulm over the summer, which she absolutely despises. This is also the time that their father, Robert Scholl, gets arrested by the Nazis for a condescending comment about Hitler and is sentenced to 4 months in prison. One of his own employees told on him. Given all of these new experiences over the summer, it's not surprising that once the whole group is finally back in Munich in November, they're determined to make their resistance movement even bigger and reach a wider range of people. Willi Graf and Christoph Probst are now actively part of the resistance group as well, and starting in late December, this also goes for Professor Kurt Huber. In January of 1943, Hans writes leaflet number 5, with revisions by Professor Huber. You'll notice that in order to appeal to the general public this time, they choose to keep the language a little bit more simple and refrain from using classic literature quotes. A couple months prior, Hans and Sophie received a generous donation from Eugen Grimminger, an accountant who's friends with their father and married to a Jewish woman. This money allows them to buy a new and more effective duplicating machine so that they can now produce at least 6,000 copies of their new leaflet. Night after night, the group toils away in the studio of Munich architect Manfred Eikemeyer that they get to use. In order to stay awake and be able to function throughout the day, they even take amphetamines, referred to as pep pills at the time, which they get from the military clinic they work at. This time, they don't only distribute the pamphlets via mail, but also hide them in public buildings, in phone booths, or on top of parked cars. They also managed to bring leaflets to countless other cities across Germany and Austria, and they ask friends to distribute them at their universities. The goal is to make it look like they're a large nationwide resistance organization. That's also why the 5th leaflet is now titled Flugblätter der Widerstandsbewegung in Deutschland, so leaflets of the resistance movement in Germany, rather than of the White Rose, and then a call to all Germans. Sophie recruits people who distribute the leaflets in Ulm and Stuttgart. She herself brings them to Augsburg, which is about a 1-hour train ride from Munich, and Traute brings them home to Hamburg, where she connects with other resistance groups. Hans and Willi, too, get in touch with groups in Berlin, the Rhineland, and the Saarland. A member of the resistance group Rote Kapelle, or Red Orchestra, even provides some financial help. Eventually, about 100 people are involved with the projects of the White Rose. One of the core statements of the 5th leaflet is,
"Hitler cannot win the war, he can only prolong it."
They call on the German people to stop blindly following their leaders unless they'd like to suffer the same fate as the Jews. They also call for a new Europe with freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and protection from the arbitrary acts of violent criminal states. In addition to the leaflets, the group now also experiments with other ways of expressing their opposition. In cloak and dagger operations, they paint wall slogans like "Mass Murderer Hitler" and crossed out swastikas on about 30 facades in central Munich. On the entrance of the university, they write "Freedom" and "Down with Hitler," and after the authorities remove the slogans, they even go back and redo them. In January of 1943, the university celebrates its 470-year anniversary, for which the Bavarian Gauleiter Paul Giesler holds a speech.
Deshalb geht mein Appell an die weibliche studentische Jugend. Ihr Arbeitseifer in allen Ehren, meine Damen. Aber die deutsche Universität ist keine Rettungsanstalt für höhere Töchter, die sich den Pflichten des Vaterlandes entziehen wollen. Es wäre wohl besser, die Studentinnen würden sich auf ihre Aufgaben als Frau besinnen und unserem Führer in jedem Universitätsjahr ein Zeugnis in Gestalt eines strammen Sohnes vorweisen.
Wir haben das gleiche Recht zu studieren!
Nur für den Gauleiter! Wir sind doch nicht in der Judenschule!
Ich kann ja verstehen, wenn einige Mädels glauben, sie müssen studieren, weil sie nicht hübsch genug sind, um einen Verehrer zu finden. Aber ich kann Sie beruhigen, meine Damen. Ich kann Ihnen gern meine Adjutanten zuweisen und ich kann Ihnen ein erfreuliches Erlebnis versprechen.
Oddly enough, this kind of reminded me of this graduation speech from earlier this year. Now, as you can see in the clip, a lot of the students, both male and female, are outraged by these statements. They storm out and start protesting in the streets. And because of how many people are participating, the Nazi authorities are unable to arrest them all. It almost seems like the spark of resistance is beginning to spread. So Kurt Huber, who gets to write the 6th leaflet, references these events and directly addresses the students in this leaflet that starts with Kommilitonen, Kommilitonen, so fellow students. And later on,
For us, there is but one slogan: fight against the party. Get out of the party organizations which are used to keep our mouths sealed and hold us in political bondage. Get out of the lecture rooms of the SS corporals and sergeants and the party bootlickers. We want genuine learning and real freedom of opinion.
This leaflet is sent out in mid-February of 1943, shortly after the German army officially loses the Battle of Stalingrad, which marks a significant turning point of the war. This time, the group makes over 2,000 copies, but since envelopes are hard to get these days, they don't have enough to send them all in the mail. So Hans suggests to bring them right to the source and distribute them at the University of Munich the next morning. Sophie agrees to help him. So the next day, on Thursday, February 18th, 1943, Hans and Sophie Scholl show up at the university at about 11 a.m. with a suitcase full of leaflets. Since it's lecture time, the hallways are completely empty. So they start placing stacks of leaflets on the ground in front of the classrooms for students to find when they come out. The siblings are already on their way out through the back door when they realize that they still have some copies left after all. They decide to turn around and go up to the 3rd floor to place a stack there. Then Sophie pushes the remaining leaflets off the banister into the atrium. What they don't realize is that they're not alone anymore. Jakob Schmidt, a janitor and loyal member of the Nazi Party, sees them and calls the Gestapo on them. Sophie and Hans are arrested and brought to the Gestapo headquarters just a few blocks down the road, where they're separated and interrogated for the next 2 days. Unfortunately, Hans has a piece of paper on him with a draft for the 7th leaflet, handwritten by Christoph Probst. Even though he tries to get rid of the evidence, the officers end up getting their hands on it and arrest Christoph 3 days later. At first, Sophie and Hans deny having anything to do with the leaflets, and instead, they both present the exact same alibi story to explain what they were doing at the university and why they had an empty suitcase on them when they were arrested. Sophie's interrogator almost buys the story and is actually about to let her go when they get the news that officers found a large amount of stamps in Hans's room, which they consider evidence. Hans confesses, but he insists that the entire project was done by him alone and that neither Sophie nor any other friends were involved or even knew about his plans. But when Sophie is informed about her brother's confession, she too decides to confess and insists that the two of them have acted alone with no further involvement or help by anyone else. The most impressive part for me is that Sophie's interrogator even offers her a way out and asks her to sign a document stating that she was solely influenced by her brother and doesn't actually believe in anything the pamphlets say. But instead of saving her own life, she denies the offer and says that she wants the same punishment as Hans, since she's just as guilty. At the end of the interrogation, she also says,
Ich bin nach wie vor der Meinung, dass ich das Beste für mein Volk getan habe. Ich bereue das nicht. Und ich will die Folgen dafür auf mich nehmen.
On February 22nd, only 4 days after their arrest at the university, Hans, Sophie, and also Christoph Probst are on trial at the Munich Justice Palace. The charge? Treason. Of course, they're not allowed to pick their own defense attorneys, and their public defenders don't actually defend them in the slightest. The Nazis even fly in their most radical judge from Berlin for this show trial, Roland Freisler, who's commonly known as Blutrichter, so blood judge, because of how often he gives the death penalty. He's not only the president of the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, but also participated in the Wannsee Conference, where the Holocaust was planned. And he's the one who drafted the murder paragraph that Germany still uses to this day. I mentioned that in my video about Nazi laws that are still in place. Throughout the trial, Freisler mainly just yells at the three friends, cuts them off, and personally insults them. And when Hans's and Sophie's parents try to enter the courtroom, he has them removed. At one point, Sophie interrupts him and says,
Was wir gesagt und geschrieben haben, das denken ja so viele. Nur wagen Sie nicht, es auszusprechen.
After less than 3 hours, they're asked for their closing remarks, where Hans asks the judge to spare his friend Christoph, who's married and just had his third child. Regardless, the judge announces the verdict.
Im Namen des deutschen Volkes, in der Strafsache gegen den Hans Fritz Scholl aus München, die Sophia Magdalena Scholl aus München und den Christoph Hermann Probst aus Altrans hat der erste Senat des Volksgerichtshofs aufgrund der Hauptverhandlung vom 22. Februar 1943 für Recht erkannt. Die Angeklagten haben im Kriege in Flugblättern zur Sabotage der Rüstung und zum Sturz der nationalsozialistischen Lebensform unseres Volkes aufgerufen, defätistische Gedanken propagiert und den Führer auf das Gemeinste beschimpft und dadurch den Feind des Reiches begünstigt und unsere Wehrkraft zersetzt. Sie werden deshalb mit dem Tode bestraft. Ihre Bürgerehre haben sie für immer verwirkt. Sie tragen die Kosten des Verfahrens.
Euer Terror ist bald vorbei.
Heute hängt ihr uns. Und morgen werdet ihr es sein.
Abführen!
On top of that, they're scheduled to be executed the very same day. Initially, the authorities plan on hanging them publicly, but they end up changing their mind as they're worried that the group would become immortalized as martyrs this way. Instead, they decide to kill them by guillotine. After the verdict, the three are brought to Stadelheim prison in Munich, where Hans and Sophie are allowed to see their parents for about half an hour to properly say goodbye. They're also given pen and paper to write final letters to their loved ones, and as devout Christians, they get to pray with a pastor. Shortly before 5 p.m., the three are picked up from their prison cells. Reportedly, the prison staff is so impressed with their bravery that they break the rules and let Sophie, Hans, and Christoph see each other one last time and give them a last cigarette to share. Then, at exactly 5 o'clock, the 21-year-old Sophie Scholl is brought into the execution room and is beheaded via guillotine. 2 minutes later, her brother Hans Scholl, 24 years old, follows. His last words are,
Es lebe die Freiheit. Long live freedom.
3 minutes after him follows Christoph Probst, 23 years old, married, and father of 3 children. Shortly after Sophie, Hans, and Christoph are killed, the Gestapo also arrests and puts on trial the 25-year-old Alexander Schmorell, Professor Kurt Huber, who was 49 at the time, and 25-year-old Willi Graf, who are all sentenced to death in April. Willi Graf particularly is held in solitary confinement for 6 long months, during which the Gestapo uses psychological torture to get more information about other White Rose members and resistance organizations, but even when they threaten to capture his family, he doesn't give in. In October of 1943, they execute him too. The authorities also arrest 14 other people who are associated with the White Rose and send the majority of them to prison, including Traute Lafrenz, Eugen Grimminger, who provided financial help, and Manfred Eikemeyer, whose studio the group was using. They also imprison Hanses and Sophie's parents, Robert and Magdalena Scholl, for several months, as well as the two sisters, Inge and Elisabeth. Werner Scholl, the youngest brother, who was able to attend his siblings' trial in his Wehrmacht uniform, is already on his way back to the front at this point, and unfortunately later dies in 1944. During her last days, in conversations with her cellmate Else Gebel, Sophie had expressed hope that their death will at least create a revolt among fellow students. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. Instead, only hours after their execution, the student leaders at the University of Munich organize a big rally to distance themselves from the White Rose and their political views. They call them traitors to the fatherland and cheer for Jakob Schmidt, the janitor who caught them. He receives a reward and a promotion for his services. But despite all of this, the words of the White Rose live on. Over the next few weeks, the chemistry student Hans Leipelt and his girlfriend Marie-Louise Jahn copy and further distribute the latest leaflet of the White Rose in Munich and Hamburg with the help of friends. They add the headline, "Und ihr Geist lebt trotzdem weiter," and their spirit lives on. In March, the story makes its way all the way to the US, where the New York Times publishes an article titled, "Nazis Execute 3 Munich Students for Writing Anti-Hitler Pamphlets." In June, the White Rose is even mentioned on Thomas Mann's radio show that the group used to listen to themselves. He specifically honors the bravery of the Munich students. But it gets even bigger. Only about a month after Sophie, Hans, and Christoph were executed, the attorney Helmut James von Moltke, who's the founder of another resistance group, brings the 6th leaflet to Oslo, where it's translated and published in Norwegian and Swedish media. Moltke also makes sure that it's translated into English, with the result that it makes its way to Great Britain, where the message is distributed by the BBC, and in July, Royal Air Force bombers drop 5 million copies of the pamphlet all over Germany. It's titled A German Leaflet, the Manifesto of the Students of Munich. In August of 1943, the International Student Assembly honors the student resistance with a rally in New York, where even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt holds a speech. Sophie's fiancé, Fritz Hartnagel, who over the course of the war is eventually left disillusioned as well, continues to stay close with the Scholl family, even after Sophie's death, and supports them both morally and financially throughout the public shame they're experiencing, and when their father, Robert, has to serve another prison sentence. After Fritz spent 6 months as a war prisoner in the US in 1945, he gets married to Sophie's sister, Elisabeth. The couple have 4 children together and stay married up until his death in 2001. In 1947, the oldest sister, Inge, ends up writing a book about her siblings' story called The White Rose, Munich 1942-43. This book is based a lot on her personal memories and has repeatedly been criticized for being factually inaccurate in some parts and for romanticizing things a little. Ever since the end of World War II, and therefore the end of the Nazi regime, Hans and Sophie Scholl, as well as the entire White Rose organization, have been celebrated as heroes and the faces of German resistance against the Nazis. So far, over 200 schools have been named after them, and there are countless memorials all over Germany. Especially in Munich, their names are very present. Since 1946, the square in front of the Munich University has been called Geschwister-Scholl-Platz, so Siblings Scholl Square, and on the ground you can find stone memorials of their leaflets, as well as other documents related to their resistance. The other university square across the street is called Professor Huber-Platz, and when you step inside the university, you'll come across a memorial in the atrium where Sophie threw down the leaflets. It features a bust of Sophie Scholl and white roses. There's also a permanent exhibit there, all of which is run by the official White Rose Foundation that survivors and relatives of the White Rose movement founded in 1986. 1987. Also, the University Department for Political Science, where I studied as well, is called Geschwister Scholl Institute. Beyond that, there are numerous streets and schools named after the other members of the White Rose all over Munich. So as a Munich native, you're definitely familiar with the story of the White Rose, but in other parts of Germany and abroad, their story isn't nearly as well known as, let's say, the story of Anne Frank. But hey, that's why I'm here making this video. In 2012, the Russian Orthodox Church actually canonized Alexander Schmorell as a saint. His title is Saint Alexander of Munich. And of course, there are countless books, movies, and exhibits on the story of the White Rose, one of them at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. If you don't mind reading subtitles, I would really recommend the movie Sophie Scholl, The Final Days from 2005, where you can see all the details of the interrogation and the trial. I also really enjoyed this Instagram project by the German Public Broadcasting, where they created the page Ich bin Sophie Scholl, I am Sophie Scholl, and reenacted the entire 10 months from when Sophie moved to Munich in May until her execution in February in real time. It's basically as if we're looking through a time travel window and see Sophie sharing her life on Instagram. The project ended in 2022, but you can still access all of the posts, and even though most of it was done in German, they also have these weekly summaries with English subtitles. The last member of the White Rose just recently passed away here in the US, by the way, Traute Lafrenz. After completing a 1-year prison sentence for her affiliation with the White Rose, she moved to the US in 1947, where she finished her medical degree, got married, and had 4 children. In 2023, she passed away in South Carolina at the proud age of 103. And to end this video with the words of Sophie Scholl, this is what she said to her cellmate Else Gebel shortly before her trial.
So ein herrlicher sonniger Tag und ich muss gehen. Aber wie viele müssen heutzutage auf den Schlachtfeldern sterben? Wie viele junge, hoffnungsvolle Männer? Was liegt an meinem Tod, wenn durch unser Handeln Tausende von Menschen aufgerüttelt und geweckt werden? Ich könnte doch auch an einer Krankheit sterben. Aber hätte das den gleichen Sinn?